I'm Madeline Carter, 22. They paid for my brother's tuition. For me, there are loan options. So I worked 3 jobs, lived on instant noodles, built a cancer detection technology from scratch. They missed every sleepless night, every breakthrough, every win. Until graduation day, when Stanford called my name, and 30,000 people stood up. Before I tell you how 4 years of silence turned into the loudest applause of their lives, drop a comment and hit follow. This one's for anyone who's ever been underestimated. The words hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. I sat there, frozen at the dining table, my fork halfway to my mouth, the smell of rosemary chicken suddenly turning my stomach. The overhead chandelier flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows on the cream-colored walls of our dining room in Wellesley. February snow pressed against the window panes, but the chill settling inside me had nothing to do with the weather. Of course, I shouldn't have been surprised. This wasn't the first time I'd been given less. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, report cards with straight A's, all had earned me polite smiles and distracted nods, while Brandon's every mediocre milestone was met with cake, balloons, and sometimes literal fireworks. But this was different. This was my future. I cleared my throat, setting my fork down slowly. And me? My voice came out steady despite the burn in my chest. What about my tuition? Dad didn't flinch. He reached for his wine glass, swirling the contents like he was discussing stock options rather than his children's lives. You're resilient. You'll find a way. I blinked, unsure I'd heard him right. Find a way, I repeated, more to myself than anyone else. Across the table, Brandon shoveled mashed potatoes onto his plate, blissfully oblivious, a grin plastered across his face. Mom picked up her napkin and dabbed at the corner of her mouth, still avoiding my eyes. You're so independent, honey, she added softly, like that was supposed to make this sting any less. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor louder than I intended. I'm not hungry anymore. No one stopped me. No one called after me. The conversation shifted almost immediately back to Brandon's upcoming campus tour and which dorm buildings had the best gym access. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding harder with each step, until I reached the sanctuary of my bedroom. The walls still bore faded posters from high school science fairs, and my bookshelf sagged with worn textbooks and secondhand novels. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved the blue leather diary, its cover soft and cracked with age. My grandmother Margaret had given it to me on my 15th birthday, her delicate handwriting inscribed inside. For Madeline, who will write her own story someday. Back then, I'd believed her. I had filled dozens of pages with dreams of scholarships, research projects, and someday Stanford. But somewhere along the way, life had dulled those pages, left them untouched for years. Until now. I flipped to a fresh sheet. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen, but the words came fast, unfiltered, like they had been waiting for this moment all along. Tonight, I stopped expecting anything from them. I capped the pen, let out a slow breath, and leaned back in my chair. The house downstairs buzzed with laughter. Brandon's laugh mostly, but it felt a world away. I stood, crossing the room to my closet door. On the back of it, taped for years, was a worn Stanford brochure. I touched the corner, smoothing the curled edges, and moved to my desk. Pulling open a folder, I began sorting through every scholarship flyer, grant opportunity, and work-study form I had collected over the past 6 months. Deadlines circled in red, notes scribbled in the margins. Glancing at the old alarm clock on my nightstand, I whispered to myself, steady and certain. Stanford or nothing. While Brandon moved into a fraternity house with designer furniture, I folded thrift store sheets in a dorm room I paid for with 3 part-time jobs. The smell of old books and industrial-strength coffee had become the background music of my life. Mornings started with shelving returned textbooks at the campus library, my fingers numb from the cold metal bookends. Afternoons were for classes: calculus, organic chemistry, cellular bioengineering. Evenings belonged to the diner 2 blocks off campus, where I poured coffee refills for Silicon Valley tech bros who didn't even look up from their laptops. Every time exhaustion crept in, I remembered Dad's voice like a curse I couldn't shake. We're being practical. Practical meant Brandon's Greek life fees, spring break trips to Cancun, and monthly allowances wired to him without fail. Practical meant me rationing ramen packets and reusing notebooks by scribbling between the lines. One night, after a double shift at the diner, I trudged back to the dorm. Samantha Lee, my roommate with a trust fund and zero understanding of financial strain, sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling on her tablet. "Long night?" she asked without looking up. "Just closed the diner." "Got a lab report due by midnight," I mumbled, peeling off my grease-smeared uniform shirt and pulling on an old hoodie. "You should sleep." I offered her a tired smile. "That's not on the schedule." It was during one of those sleep-deprived afternoons in cellular engineering that my life took an unexpected turn. Dr. Lauren Whitaker, head of the biomedical engineering department, handed back our graded exams. My paper had a bright red 100 circled at the top, with one line written beneath, "See me after class." My heart jumped to my throat. I gathered my books, stuffing my cracked notebook into my bag, and waited by her desk while the rest of the students filed out. "Miss Carter," she said, flipping through her tablet, "your analysis on membrane permeability, that's graduate-level work." "Thank you," I said cautiously, unsure where this was going. She looked up, her expression unreadable but her tone deliberate. "Have you ever considered joining a research lab?" I blinked. "I'd love to, but I work 2 jobs. I don't really have time." Her gaze softened, like she understood more than I was saying out loud. "I won't sugarcoat it. Research in my lab won't come with a paycheck. Not at first, but it could change your entire academic trajectory." I hesitated, doing a quick mental calculation of how many hours I could shave off from the diner without defaulting on my meal plan. "Let me know by Monday," she said, already turning to her next task. "Good research requires sacrifice, but from what I've seen, you're no stranger to that." That weekend, I stood by the campus laundry room, folding threadbare t-shirts and staring at my phone. My banking app displayed a balance low enough to make my stomach churn, but I pulled up Dr. Whitaker's email and typed my reply. "I'm in." By the following week, I was splitting my daylight hours between classes and experiments on protein binding rates. Nighttime still belonged to the diner, but at least now my exhaustion felt like it was building towards something more than just survival. There were days I doubted myself, like the time I almost fell asleep standing during a lab procedure. Or when I skipped meals to save cash for lab supplies the department budget couldn't cover. But every time I felt like crumbling, I pictured Stanford's graduation stage. I pictured standing there, not as the daughter they had underestimated, but as someone impossible to ignore. Late one night, after finishing data entry for Dr. Whitaker, I sat on the dorm's window ledge, holding a cold cup of coffee that I had reheated twice but never drank. The campus lawn below shimmered under the glow of lampposts. Students walked past in groups, laughing, free of the weight I carried. I wrapped my hands tighter around the cup, letting the chill from the ceramics seep into my skin. 3 years down, 1 to go. Keep going. Sleep became optional. Food, a luxury. But proving them wrong? Non-negotiable. By November of senior year, my body had become a machine fueled by caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer resentment. Dark circles shadowed my eyes no concealer could hide. My hands trembled when I pipetted solutions, but I kept going. Always going. Dr. Whitaker's words echoed in my mind during the worst moments. Even brilliant machines break down without maintenance. Maintenance wasn't on my schedule. Prototype 1 had failed spectacularly. Protein denaturation within the first trial. Prototype 2 didn't even produce measurable conductivity. Prototype 3. I didn't even want to think about Prototype 3. That disaster had ruined 3 weeks of work and set us back on material budgets. Thanksgiving break loomed, and campus emptied out like clockwork. Samantha packed for her family trip to Napa Valley. Brandon texted me a photo from Barcelona. Him on a beach with a cocktail in hand, captioned, "Work hard, play harder. Hope you're having fun in the lab, sis." I didn't reply. Dr. Whitaker approached me in the lab 2 days before Thanksgiving. "You should go home," she said, handing me a folder of calibration data. I shook my head. "I have lab work." She studied me carefully. "Madeline, you haven't slept more than 3 hours a night for weeks." "I'll sleep when the sensor works." Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. She just placed a protein bar next to my laptop and walked away. The lab grew colder at night. The hum of machines and the soft click of the HVAC system became my lullabies. I curled up under the workbench with a throw blanket from the lounge, waking at 4 a.m. to restart sample tests. By Thanksgiving night, my stomach felt hollow, my head pounded, but my hands kept moving. Sample dilution, voltage application, data logging, repeat. When the new test run started, I didn't expect anything different. The fluorescent reader blinked once, then twice, and held steady. I froze. Pulled off my gloves with shaking fingers. Checked the calibration. Then checked the raw data. Then reran the sample. Same result. The sensor had detected the cancer marker at a concentration 50 times lower than any of our previous attempts. I grabbed the results printout and bolted across the lab to Dr. Whitaker's office. She was still there, of course. She always stayed late before major testing phases. She looked up from her laptop, her eyes widening as I handed her the sheet. She scanned the numbers, silence stretching between us. Her shoulders rose, then dropped with a long, shaky breath. And then, without warning, she stood and wrapped me in a tight hug. "Do you realize what this means?" She whispered against my hair. "This isn't just a thesis project. This could save lives." For the first time in weeks, tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. There wasn't time for emotion yet. We stayed another 6 hours running verification tests. I logged data until my fingers cramped. Dr. Whitaker called a colleague from oncology for external review. By the time I collapsed onto the lab floor, hugging a spare pillow from the lounge, my phone vibrated on the counter above me. Groggy and half delirious, I reached for it. An email notification from the Buchanan Prize Committee lit up the screen. "Congratulations, you've been selected as a finalist." I stared at the message, heart pounding, then buried my face in the pillow, too tired to cry but smiling anyway. "We'll try to make your ceremony, if it doesn't conflict with Brandon's events." I stared at the text on my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen like it might spontaneously combust from the weight of my frustration. The message was from Mom, sent at 9:03 p.m., 3 days before graduation. Short. Casual. Like I was just another calendar item to be squeezed between their flights and Brandon's business school luncheon. I placed the phone face down on my desk and let out a slow breath. Samantha, perched on her bed, glanced up from her suitcase. "Let me guess," she said, folding another sundress into a neat pile. "Family drama?" I managed a tight smile. "Nothing new." It was fitting, really. The last time my parents attended anything remotely related to my academics, well, no. Actually, they never had. Dr. Whitaker's words from our meeting that afternoon echoed in my mind. "This is your stage. Own it." The university had sent the official email that morning. I was to be honored during the commencement ceremony before degrees were conferred. My name would be called. My research would be announced. My face, whether I wanted it or not, would be projected onto 2 jumbo screens at Stanford Stadium. But my family? They were too busy debating what color tie Brandon should wear. I pulled open my desk drawer and retrieved the blue leather journal. Grandma Margaret's handwriting had faded a little over the years, but the words inside remained permanent in ways my parents' attention never had. I traced a finger along the edge of one page and whispered, barely audible even to myself, "Tomorrow." The next morning arrived clear and bright. California sun pouring through the dorm room blinds far too early for my sleep-deprived body. Samantha stood by my closet, holding up my gown. "Time to layer on your academic bling." she joked. Seriously, Madeline, you're carrying more honor cords than anyone I've seen. I laughed, though it caught in my throat. Together, we fastened cords, adjusted the Buchanan medal, and pinned on my research distinction ribbon. I slipped on the navy blue dress I'd bought months earlier, a quiet promise to myself that I'd wear it under my gown when this day came. By 8:45 a.m., I stood in the staging area behind the stadium with hundreds of other graduates. The air buzzed with nerves and sunblock and last-minute selfie requests. I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned to find one of the commencement organizers holding a clipboard. "Madeline Carter?" she asked. I nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of my heartbeat. She smiled, flipping through her notes. "Quick pronunciation check. Your full name will be read before the degree conferral. You're in the special recognition section." My breath caught. They were really going to do it. I thanked her, stepping back in line just as the overhead speakers crackled to life. A low hum spread across the crowd as the voice of the Master of Ceremonies filled the stadium. "And now, we'd like to recognize an extraordinary achievement. For 4 years, they didn't see me. Today, they'll have no choice." The sun was relentless, casting bright beams onto the stadium seats and making the rows of black gowns shimmer like a rolling sea. My hands trembled, but not from nerves. At least not the kind I'd felt before debate competitions or research presentations. This was something deeper, something that sat heavy in my chest. I stood just off stage, the thin fabric of my gown sticking to the back of my legs, my fingers curling into tight fists at my sides. From this angle, I could see the guest seating area. My parents were easy to spot. Dad sat stiff-backed, arms crossed, a crease of impatience between his brows. Mom dabbed sweat from her temple, fanning herself with the program, glancing at her watch like she had somewhere more important to be. Brandon lounged beside them, sunglasses perched on his head, scrolling through his phone. They weren't looking for me. Of course not. The Master of Ceremonies cleared his throat. The mic crackled, amplifying his voice across the stadium. "Before we confer degrees today," he began, "it is our honor to recognize an extraordinary achievement from one of our undergraduates." A shift rippled through the crowd. Murmurs, heads turning. President Whitaker stepped forward, her voice steady and warm. "This year, Stanford witnessed a breakthrough that exemplifies the very heart of innovation and resilience." I inhaled slowly. The air felt thick. "Madeline Carter," she said, "would you please join me at the podium?" A collective pause spread over the stadium like a held breath. I stepped forward. The applause started small, then grew, expanding across the field like a rising tide. I walked past my peers, past rows of faculty, keeping my eyes fixed ahead. In my periphery, I caught the movement of my father leaning forward, confusion knitting his brow. Mom's program slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the ground. I climbed the steps to the stage. President Whitaker turned to the audience. "Graduating today with highest honors in biomedical engineering, Madeline Carter is also this year's recipient of the Buchanan Innovation Prize." Another round of applause. "But beyond academic excellence," she continued, "Madeline led a groundbreaking research project in early cancer detection, developing a biosensor technology that has drawn national attention and secured a multi-million-dollar development contract with Metanova Corporation." My heart pounded against my ribs, but I kept my face composed. President Whitaker turned to me, smiling. "Madeline, would you like to say a few words?" I stepped to the microphone. The stadium hushed. "For 4 years," I began, letting the words sit heavy in the air. "I've walked this campus knowing that every late night, every skipped meal, every exhausted morning was mine alone to carry." I paused, scanning the crowd. My gaze found my parents. Dad's face had drained of color. Mom's mouth hung slightly open. "I didn't receive a penny of financial support from my family," I continued, voice clear and measured. "While others had parents covering tuition, housing, and expenses, I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. I slept under lab tables. I had nights where I had to choose between buying dinner or buying lab supplies. A wave of silence spread, thick and electric. But I kept going, I said softly, then straightened my shoulders, projecting the words toward every corner of the stadium. Because I believed in my work, and in myself. I let that hang for just a beat. And to every student out there who's been told they're not worth investing in, let today prove otherwise. The applause erupted like a detonation. I held my place for just a moment longer, letting the sound wrap around me, letting the years of invisibility crack and fall away like old paint. As I turned to step down from the stage, I caught one last look at my parents. Their faces were pale. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" Dad asked, voice shaking for the first time in my life. I stood on the lawn behind Stanford Hall, the sunset burning low on the horizon, throwing long shadows across the grass. The ceremony had ended over an hour ago, but I hadn't gone far. I'd needed a moment to breathe, to let it settle. They found me anyway. Dad approached first, his tie askew, jacket abandoned somewhere along the way. Mom trailed behind, blotchy-eyed, her makeup streaked like she hadn't expected the day to end in tears. Brandon lingered just a few steps back, unusually quiet. I crossed my arms over my chest. "Why didn't I tell you?" I repeated, my voice flat. Would it have mattered? Dad opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his shoes like they suddenly held answers. Mom sniffled, stepping closer. "Madeline, we had no idea." Her hands trembled at her sides. "All those jobs, the lab work, the awards, you never said." I let out a dry laugh. Number I didn't. Because for years, every time I tried, you changed the subject, or redirected the conversation back to Brandon. Her lips quivered. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I cut her off, sharp but measured. "Let me remind you, when I got accepted here, you celebrated him. When I worked 2 jobs just to cover my books, you sent him on spring break. When I pulled all-nighters for research that could save lives, you sent him money for rent on a house he never cleaned." Dad rubbed the back of his neck like he wanted to disappear. We thought you had it handled." "Right," I said, bitterness seeping through. Because self-sufficiency is such a good excuse for neglect. Brandon shifted awkwardly before stepping forward, voice low but clear. "I should have said something, years ago." He swallowed hard. "I knew it wasn't right. I didn't want to rock the boat." I met his eyes. For the first time, I saw something like sincerity there. Mom pressed a tissue to her mouth, muffling a sob. "We're proud of you now, Maddie. So proud. Truly." "Now," I echoed, staring at both of them. "You're proud of me now because it's convenient, because it looks good, because people are clapping." Neither of them answered. The air between us grew thick, weighted by years of silence they had once considered harmless. I took a breath, letting it steady me. "I'm not ready to forgive," I said, each word landing like a stone. "But I'm done letting your absence define me." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the long shadow of everything they hadn't seen. For years, Madeline had been their afterthought, a quiet background to Brandon's spotlight. But on that stage, with the applause still ringing and her parents' stunned faces frozen in disbelief, the scales finally tipped. Justice didn't arrive gently. It came like a long-withheld truth crashing through layers of denial. Because when neglect is met with relentless determination, even the most comfortable illusions eventually shatter. And as she walked away, one thing became certain. They would never again mistake her silence for weakness.